I'm Daniel Pick. I'm a psychoanalyst and I'm a professor of history at Birkbeck College, University of London. Welcome to my exp. One important set of concerns and anxieties and writings of the post-Second World War period and the Cold War is about hidden persuasion in extreme and violent coercive situations. So groups of people, or sometimes whole populations, that are in thrall to a dictator, to a party, to a singular authority that has total control over their lives. And I think that literature is dramatic and extreme and is explored in the post-war human sciences as well as in popular culture and movies, which would be about prisoners who are captives of a totalitarian regime and who are obliged to fit in and whose minds are broken down, manipulated, and ultimately may be subject to brainwashing. The most perhaps famous and important development of that kind of thinking about the more sort of subtle and obscure forms of power and knowledge and influence that are not in the totalitarian world zeroes in on advertising in the West as a field of persuasion where supposedly free subjects who are celebrated for living in the so-called free world, which has become a kind of banner from the 1940s onwards of Western political discourse, the free world versus the totalitarian world. But what kinds of covert pressure and underhand influence are exerted on democratic subjects and what come to be known as consumers, rather than just voters or subjects, but consumers, that shape the way we behave, feel, or think? So this is an important development, and it's really an exploration of techniques from the psychological sciences that get mobilized by the advertising industry, or to use the shorthand, Madison Avenue, where the HQ of many of the big advertising agencies are housed in Madison Avenue in Manhattan, but really the kind of not just American advertising industry, but the global advertising industry increasingly. But what kinds of techniques are used to persuade people to desire things? You know, how do you expand markets? The advertising burgeons, and the advertising industry is drawing on techniques of what comes to be known as motivational research, a field that was also developed by a particular émigré psychologist called Dictator, who claims to be drawing on Freud, as does Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, who's another pioneer of kind of corporate psychology and public relations. But first Bernays and then Dictator, in a way, hire themselves out to corporate America to try to craft messages and increasingly branding and the style of products and campaigns that will generate maximum demand. And Dictator sets up an institute for motivational research and does get hired, has a very successful, flourishing career, but he falls foul of one of the kind of writers who's writing with much more alarm rather than in celebration of all this Madison Avenue stuff, which is kind of a man called Vance Packard, a journalist who starts writing books through the 50s and 60s, but most famously his book of 1957 called The Hidden Persuaders. Packard's concern is not just with the power of corporate bosses and boards of companies to mobilize these sorts of techniques to persuade people to part with their money, to buy cars or cigarettes, or to buy houses or to go on holiday, with dreams of fulfillment. It's also about the way in which political parties are starting to harvest the data that is being generated, or to use these techniques like focus groups, but to sort of, in a way, to try to tap into the unconscious wishes of electorates, and to then craft politicians increasingly to, as it were, meet the fantasy of the electorate. So the idea of kind of choreographing, not necessarily just choreographing the masses to fit in with the political party or the leader, but grooming the leader to fulfill the fantasy that's required by the electorate.